The easiest way to reveal a person's character is to give them someone they believe they can look down on. At exactly 8:37 on a grey Monday morning, laughter echoed across the polished marble lobby of Carter Dynamics, blending with the soft hum of elevators and the distant tapping of expensive leather shoes. No one noticed the man pushing the old janitor's cart except when they wanted to make a joke. Ethan Carter moved slowly across the floor, guiding the damp mop in smooth, careful lines as sunlight poured through the 40-foot glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. His faded blue maintenance uniform carried no title anyone cared to read. A pair of worn work gloves covered his hands, and a plain baseball cap shaded his face, just enough to keep curious eyes from lingering. To everyone rushing toward another day of meetings, forecasts, and executive decisions, he was invisible. Or perhaps even worse. He was someone they assumed didn't matter. "Hey, watch the water," one executive snapped without slowing down, stepping around the freshly cleaned floor as though Ethan himself had become another obstacle to avoid. A younger manager chuckled. "Careful. We can't have the cleaning guy delaying the board meeting." Several others laughed, not because the joke was particularly clever, but because laughter often costs less than kindness. Ethan simply nodded once. "Sorry about that, sir," he replied quietly, his voice calm enough to disappear beneath the noise of the lobby. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply reached for a dry towel and wiped away a few drops of water that had never really been in anyone's path to begin with. 23 minutes later, not one of those voices would find another joke to tell. On the opposite side of the lobby, Claire Bennett balanced a silver serving tray with practiced grace as she stepped out of the executive cafe. At 29, she had learned to read people long before they spoke. Years of serving CEOs, attorneys, investors, and politicians had taught her that expensive watches rarely measured humility. She watched the exchange from across the room. No outrage crossed her face. Just quiet disappointment. As Ethan rolled his cart toward the hallway leading to the executive conference center, Claire picked up an extra cup of fresh coffee from the counter. "Excuse me," she called gently. Ethan stopped and turned. "You look like you've been working since sunrise," she said with a warm smile, extending the cup toward him. "Thought this might help." He hesitated for only a second before accepting it with both hands. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That's very thoughtful." "Cold morning," Claire replied. "It is," Ethan answered, looking briefly toward the towering windows where dark clouds drifted over the skyline. "But mornings usually tell you more about people than afternoons ever do." Claire smiled politely, unsure exactly what he meant, but somehow feeling the sentence deserved remembering. Before she could answer, another executive walked past, shaking his head. "Claire," he called, "don't waste premium coffee on maintenance staff. Save it for the board members." She looked at him, then calmly looked back at Ethan. "Everyone deserves hot coffee," she said simply. Ethan smiled for the first time that morning, a quiet smile that seemed almost grateful for something much larger than the drink itself. Neither of them noticed the digital clock above the reception desk quietly changing from 8:36 to 8:37, counting down the final minutes before the most important board meeting in Carter Dynamics history. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the hallway long after Claire returned to the executive cafe. She did not think much about the small act of kindness. To her, it was no different from holding a door or offering someone a genuine smile. Yet as she polished crystal glasses behind the espresso counter, she found herself glancing through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the executive corridor. Ethan had already resumed his work, moving at the same steady pace, guiding the mop across the marble as though every inch of the building deserved the same care. He never hurried. He never complained. His movements carried an unusual precision that reminded Claire of someone who believed details mattered even when nobody was watching. Around him, the building grew louder. Assistants hurried between offices carrying tablets and thick presentation folders. Attorneys arrived with leather briefcases. Security personnel quietly adjusted their earpieces near the elevators leading to the board floor. Every conversation seemed to circle around the same subject. The board meeting. It was all anyone could discuss. Rumors had spread for weeks that the company was about to announce the most significant leadership decision in its history. Some believed the chief executive officer would become chairman. Others insisted an outside investor had quietly purchased controlling shares. Nobody seemed certain. Uncertainty made successful people surprisingly nervous. Claire placed another tray of pastries onto the serving counter, just as Richard Holloway entered the cafe. As Senior Vice President of Operations, Richard carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed every room belonged to him the moment he stepped inside. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver tie reflected the morning light. Expensive cologne followed him several seconds after he passed. He accepted his double espresso without making eye contact. Then he noticed Ethan through the glass wall. Richard smiled, although there was no warmth behind it. Still polishing the floor, he muttered to the executive standing beside him. "I wish everyone worked as hard as maintenance. At least somebody around here knows how to stay in his lane." The others laughed politely. One younger director leaned closer and added, "Maybe he thinks if he keeps cleaning long enough, they will let him sit in on the meeting." More laughter followed. Claire lowered her eyes toward the coffee machine. She had worked long enough around powerful people to recognize the difference between humor and arrogance. Ethan, meanwhile, continued cleaning as if none of the words had reached him. A few minutes later, he paused near one of the enormous lobby windows. Outside, light rain had begun to fall across the Chicago skyline, turning the streets into ribbons of silver beneath the morning traffic. He folded the cleaning cloth with careful hands before placing it neatly inside the cart. Nothing about him appeared rushed. Nothing suggested embarrassment. It was almost as though the opinions surrounding him carried no weight at all. Claire quietly walked into the hallway with another small stack of paper cups. "Would you like a refill before I take breakfast upstairs?" she asked. Ethan looked at the empty cup she had given him only minutes earlier. "Only if it is not taking one away from someone else." She smiled. "There is plenty." As she poured the fresh coffee, Ethan noticed a framed photograph hanging near the conference entrance. It showed the company headquarters, shortly after construction had been completed almost 20 years earlier. His eyes rested on it for a brief moment before he spoke. "Buildings change," he said softly. "The people inside them change even faster." Claire looked toward the photograph, unsure why it seemed familiar to him. "Have you worked here long?" she asked. Ethan answered with the faintest smile. "Long enough to remember when those trees outside were barely taller than the benches." Before Claire could ask another question, the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. A group of board members stepped into the hallway. Conversations stopped. Shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. Richard glanced toward Ethan again and frowned. "Maintenance," he called across the corridor, "finish up before the directors arrive. We cannot have cleaning carts cluttering executive space." Ethan simply nodded once. "Of course." He slowly rolled the cart toward the side hallway, leaving the polished floor shining behind him. Richard never noticed that several members of the security team instinctively watched Ethan with quiet respect as he passed. Neither did anyone else. Everyone remained too focused on impressing the people they believed held the greatest authority. Above the conference room doors, a digital clock silently advanced another minute. The empty chair at the head of the boardroom table was still waiting. So was everyone else. Inside the executive boardroom, polished walnut stretched the length of a table designed for only 12 people, yet more than 30 senior leaders had gathered around its edges hoping to witness a moment that could reshape the future of Carter Dynamics. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the rainy Chicago skyline, while muted conversations drifted beneath the soft glow of recessed lights. Every leather chair was occupied except one. The largest chair at the head of the table remained empty. No nameplate rested in front of it. No folder had been placed there. It seemed almost intentional, as though the room itself was waiting for someone who answered to no introduction. Chief Executive Officer Daniel Mercer checked his watch for the third time in less than 5 minutes. Although his expression remained composed, his fingers tapped lightly against the conference folder in front of him. The board secretary leaned closer and whispered, "We are ready to begin as soon as the chairman arrives." Daniel gave a slight nod, but uncertainty flickered across his face. Very few people had actually met the controlling shareholder in recent years. Most communication had come through attorneys, handwritten approvals, and quiet decisions that somehow always proved correct. Stories circulated throughout the company. Some believed the chairman had retired overseas. Others insisted he preferred complete anonymity. A few claimed he secretly visited company locations without announcing himself. Nobody knew which version was true. Across the hallway, Claire arranged crystal water glasses on a silver serving cart for the final time, before bringing refreshments into the boardroom. Every glass reflected the morning light like polished mirrors. She paused for a brief second, when she noticed Ethan placing his neatly folded cleaning cloth back inside the maintenance cart. He examined the marble floor one final time, making certain every streak had disappeared. There was a quiet satisfaction in the way he looked at finished work. Not pride. Simply respect for doing a job well. "Looks perfect," Claire said with an encouraging smile. Ethan glanced across the shining floor. "Perfection is difficult," he answered gently. "But effort is always a choice." Claire smiled again. There was something about the way he spoke that never sounded accidental. Every sentence seemed carefully considered, as though experience had taught him the value of simple words. Before either of them could continue, Richard Holloway stepped out of the conference room carrying a stack of financial reports. He nearly collided with Ethan before stopping abruptly. His eyes dropped toward the maintenance cart with visible annoyance. "You are still here?" Richard asked sharply. "The board meeting starts any minute. This hallway needs to stay clear." Ethan quietly reached for the cart handle. "I was just leaving." Richard sighed impatiently. "Good. The last thing we need today is someone pushing a mop through executive traffic." He continued walking without waiting for a response. Claire watched Ethan carefully, expecting at least a trace of frustration. Instead, he simply moved the cart several feet farther down the corridor, parking it neatly beside a service doorway where it would not inconvenience anyone. Then he took a clean cloth from his pocket and carefully wiped a tiny fingerprint from the polished brass elevator frame. No audience. No recognition. Just another detail completed because he believed details mattered. At the far end of the corridor, 2 security officers exchanged a subtle glance as Ethan passed. One gave the slightest respectful nod. Ethan acknowledged it with the same quiet courtesy before continuing toward the elevators. Claire noticed the exchange. It lasted only a heartbeat, yet it felt strangely different from the way security greeted everyone else. Before she had time to think about it, the board secretary stepped into the hallway with visible urgency. "Everyone please take your seats," she announced. "The meeting will begin immediately." Executives filed into the conference room with folders pressed against tailored suits. Conversations faded. Laptops opened. Coffee cups settled onto polished coasters. The rain outside continued falling in gentle sheets against the glass, while silence gradually filled the room. Daniel Mercer remained standing beside the empty chair at the head of the table, his eyes occasionally shifting toward the closed entrance. Richard leaned toward another executive and whispered confidently, "Whoever walks through that door today is about to become the most powerful person in this company." The digital clock above the entrance changed to 9 o'clock exactly. A soft chime echoed through the executive floor. Then, somewhere beyond the closed conference room doors, the quiet sound of measured footsteps began moving steadily down the hallway. The footsteps never hurried. They echoed through the executive hallway with calm, measured confidence, blending with the quiet rhythm of the rain against the towering windows. Inside the boardroom, conversations faded one by one as everyone instinctively looked toward the closed entrance. Daniel Mercer straightened his jacket. Richard Holloway adjusted his tie and placed both hands on the polished table, preparing to greet the person he believed would shape the company's future. Claire stood quietly beside the refreshment station, just outside the room, waiting for the signal to serve coffee once the meeting officially began. She glanced toward the hallway and caught sight of Ethan again. Instead of leaving the executive floor, he had stopped beside a large indoor planter near the conference entrance. Kneeling down, he carefully picked up a single green leaf that had fallen onto the marble floor. He examined it for a brief second before placing it gently into the nearby recycling bin. The hallway looked immaculate, yet he still noticed details everyone else ignored. Richard stepped outside, just long enough to see him. His expression hardened immediately. "You are still here?" he asked, his voice carrying through the otherwise quiet corridor. Ethan looked up calmly. "I was making sure everything was ready." Richard laughed softly, shaking his head. "Ready? Your job ended when the floor started shining. The rest of this hallway belongs to executives now." Ethan simply nodded. "Understood." Richard pointed toward the maintenance cart parked neatly against the service wall. "Move it farther away. The chairman does not need to see cleaning equipment the moment he arrives." Without hesitation, Ethan reached for the cart and slowly rolled it toward the service corridor. Every movement remained deliberate. Every gesture remained respectful. Claire watched the exchange with growing discomfort. She had never understood why certain people confused authority with superiority. She quietly stepped closer. "Can I help you with anything?" she asked Ethan, after Richard disappeared back inside the boardroom. Ethan smiled gratefully. "You already have." She looked puzzled. "Sometimes respect is remembered longer than success," he said. Before Claire could answer, another executive hurried past, while reviewing financial reports on a tablet. Without looking up, he casually placed his empty paper coffee cup on top of Ethan's maintenance cart, instead of carrying it the extra few feet to the trash can. Ethan noticed it, removed the cup, and quietly disposed of it himself. No complaint. No sigh. Just another small task completed without drawing attention. Claire felt a knot forming inside her chest. She walked toward the waste bin herself, wishing she had reached the cup first. Ethan seemed to notice her disappointment. "People reveal themselves in ordinary moments," he said gently. "Those moments matter more than they realize." The words stayed with her. Across the executive floor, the atmosphere continued changing. Board members checked their phones less frequently now. Assistants whispered into headsets. Even the security officers stood a little straighter than before. Something important was about to happen. One of the younger analysts quietly approached Richard inside the conference room. "Have they confirmed the chairman's arrival?" he whispered. Richard answered confidently. "Any second now." I have spent 15 years preparing for this meeting. Around the table, several executives nodded in agreement, rehearsing smiles they hoped would make favorable first impressions. Outside, Ethan removed his work gloves with slow, careful movements. Instead of placing them into the maintenance cart, he folded them neatly and slipped them into his pocket. Then he adjusted the sleeves of his faded uniform until every crease rested perfectly. Claire noticed another curious detail. A veteran security supervisor walking toward the entrance slowed his pace as he passed Ethan. Without saying a single word, the officer gave a subtle nod filled with unmistakable respect. Ethan returned the gesture, just as quietly. Neither man smiled. Neither acknowledged the moment further. It lasted less than a second, yet it carried the silent familiarity of two people who had known each other for years. Claire frowned slightly. It was the second time she had witnessed security greeting Ethan differently from everyone else. Before she could make sense of it, the board secretary opened the conference room doors and announced in a steady voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. The chairman has arrived." Every chair moved at once. The room fell completely silent. Richard lifted his chin toward the entrance with complete confidence. Daniel Mercer turned toward the hallway. Claire instinctively followed their gaze. For one brief heartbeat, the doorway remained empty. Then a familiar figure stepped into view from the quiet corridor beyond. The figure who entered the doorway did not look any different from the man everyone had ignored throughout the morning. Ethan Carter still wore the same faded maintenance uniform. His sleeves were neatly rolled. His work boots carried the faint shine of someone who believed even ordinary things deserved proper care. The only difference was that he was no longer pushing the maintenance cart. He walked with quiet confidence, his hands resting naturally at his sides, his expression calm, almost peaceful. For several long seconds, nobody inside the boardroom moved. Richard Holloway frowned first. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding. He stepped toward the entrance, forcing a polite smile that barely concealed his irritation. "Sir, I believe you have the wrong room," he said. "The executive board meeting is private." Ethan stopped only a few feet from the doorway. His eyes met Richard's without anger or embarrassment. "I know," he replied softly. "That is why I am here." A few uneasy laughs floated across the room before quickly fading. Several executives exchanged confused glances, expecting security to intervene. Instead, something entirely unexpected happened. The two senior security officers standing beside the conference entrance immediately straightened their posture. Without hesitation, both men nodded respectfully toward Ethan. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," one of them said in a calm, professional voice. The room became perfectly still. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. Richard stared at the officers as though he had misheard them. Daniel Mercer slowly lowered the folder in his hands. His expression shifted from confusion to unmistakable recognition. Without speaking another word, Daniel stepped away from his place beside the conference table. Then, in full view of every executive present, the chief executive officer extended his hand toward the quiet man wearing the maintenance uniform. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," Daniel said with genuine respect. "We have been waiting for you." No one laughed now. Ethan accepted the handshake with the same modest smile Claire had seen only moments earlier in the hallway. There was no dramatic gesture. No attempt to command attention. He simply thanked Daniel with a slight nod before walking farther into the room. One by one, the members of the board rose from their chairs. Some did so immediately. Others hesitated only a heartbeat before realizing everyone else was already standing. Leather chairs slid backward across the polished floor in perfect unison. Richard remained frozen beside the entrance. His face had lost every trace of confidence. The board secretary quietly approached Ethan carrying a slim leather portfolio. "Good morning, Mr. Chairman," she said. "Everything is prepared exactly as you requested." Ethan accepted the portfolio. "Thank you, Olivia." He knew her name. Not because someone had whispered it to him moments earlier, but because he had clearly known it for years. Claire watched from the refreshment station, struggling to connect the man she had offered coffee to with the person every executive in the room now regarded with unmistakable respect. Suddenly his earlier words returned to her. Buildings change. The people inside them change even faster. She finally understood why those words had sounded less like conversation and more like experience. Ethan walked toward the large chair at the head of the conference table. Before sitting down, he paused beside the panoramic windows overlooking the rain-covered skyline. He looked outside for a quiet moment, as though appreciating the city before turning back toward the people gathered before him. No expensive suit announced his authority. No gold watch reflected the light. Only silence filled the room. It carried more weight than any title ever could. Richard swallowed hard before finally finding his voice. "Mr. Carter," he began cautiously, I was not aware." Ethan raised one gentle hand, stopping him before the sentence could continue. "That much was obvious," he answered without the slightest hint of bitterness. His tone remained calm, almost kind, making the unfinished apology feel even heavier. Around the table, no one dared interrupt. Every executive suddenly remembered the careless jokes, the impatient remarks, the paper cup left on the maintenance cart, the assumptions made before asking a single question. Claire lowered her eyes for just a second, grateful that the only thing she had offered Ethan that morning had been a warm cup of coffee and simple respect. As Ethan finally took his seat at the head of the table, the empty chair that had waited all morning no longer seemed imposing. It simply looked like it had been waiting for the right person to return home. No one reached for the presentation remote. No one opened a laptop. The silence that settled over the boardroom carried more weight than the quarterly reports stacked neatly across the polished table. Ethan Carter rested the leather portfolio before him without opening it immediately. Instead, he looked around the room with quiet patience, meeting each pair of eyes for only a moment before moving to the next. There was no anger in his expression. No satisfaction. Only calm observation. Daniel Mercer remained standing until Ethan gave the slightest nod, inviting everyone else to take their seats. Chairs slid softly across the floor as executives lowered themselves into place, though the confidence many had carried only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. Richard Holloway sat more slowly than anyone else. His hands rested on the table, but his fingers no longer remained steady. Ethan finally opened the portfolio. Inside were only a few documents and a slim tablet. He tapped the screen once. The large display mounted on the conference room wall illuminated with the company logo, before transitioning to a live security archive. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan spoke for the first time since sitting down. "Before we discuss revenue, expansion, or strategy," he said in a calm voice, "I would like us to review this morning together." No one objected. The recording began. There was no dramatic music. No commentary. Only ordinary moments captured by security cameras throughout the executive floor. The first clip showed employees entering the building while Ethan quietly polished the marble entrance. Another showed him holding the elevator door for a receptionist carrying heavy files. She smiled and thanked him before rushing away. The next camera displayed him carefully wiping rainwater from the lobby to prevent anyone from slipping as visitors continued walking past without noticing. Every action appeared simple. Every gesture almost invisible. Then the recordings changed. Richard's voice echoed through the room as he instructed Ethan to remove the maintenance cart, because executives would soon arrive. Laughter from nearby managers filled the speakers. Another clip revealed the younger director joking about Ethan attending the board meeting. Someone casually placed an empty coffee cup onto the maintenance cart, instead of using the trash container only a few feet away. Each scene lasted only seconds. None of them appeared cruel by themselves. Together, however, they painted a picture no one around the table wanted to see. Claire stood quietly near the refreshment station, watching the faces around the room change with every passing clip. Eyes lowered. Shoulders stiffened. Even Daniel Mercer looked troubled, though he had said nothing disrespectful himself. Ethan stopped the recording before the moment Claire handed him the cup of coffee. The screen faded back to black. Silence returned once again. This time it felt heavier. Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he began carefully, "I owe you an apology." Ethan looked toward him without interrupting. Richard lowered his eyes. "I judged you by your uniform instead of your character. There is no excuse for that." Ethan remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "The apology is appreciated," he said gently. "But this meeting is not about me." Several people looked up in surprise. Ethan folded his hands together on the table. This company was never built on glass offices or executive titles. It was built by thousands of people, whose names rarely appear in annual reports. Receptionists who greet strangers with kindness. Engineers who stay late because they believe in their work. Cafeteria staff who remember everyone's favorite breakfast. Custodians who arrive before sunrise so others can begin their day in a clean building. His voice never rose. It did not need to. Every sentence landed with quiet clarity. The moment we begin believing that someone's value is measured by a business card or a tailored suit, we begin weakening the very culture that made this company successful. Around the table, no one attempted to defend themselves. The words were impossible to dismiss, because they contained no accusation, only truth. Ethan glanced briefly toward the rain beyond the windows before continuing. "Several years ago, I stepped away from daily operations, because I wanted to understand what this company had become when no one believed I was watching. Today was never designed as a trap. It was simply an opportunity to observe ordinary moments." His eyes moved calmly across the room once more. Leadership is never revealed during presentations. It is revealed in hallways, elevators, cafeterias, and conversations with people who have nothing to offer you except the chance to show them respect. Claire quietly looked down at the empty coffee cup still resting beside the refreshment station, suddenly realizing it had never been about the coffee at all. The room remained silent long after Ethan finished speaking. Outside, the rain continued tracing quiet paths across the towering windows, softening the sharp outlines of the city beyond. Inside, every executive seemed absorbed by thoughts they had not expected to confront that morning. Financial projections no longer occupied their attention. Market strategy no longer seemed urgent. For the first time in years, the conversation inside the boardroom had shifted away from numbers and toward people. Ethan allowed the silence to breathe. He had learned long ago that the most important lessons rarely arrived through raised voices. They arrived when there was nothing left to hide behind. He slowly closed the leather portfolio and rested both hands on the polished table. Every organization eventually becomes a reflection of what it chooses to reward, he said quietly. If we reward only performance, people will compete. If we reward only authority, people will obey. But if we reward character, people will protect one another even when nobody is watching. Daniel Mercer nodded almost instinctively. The words resonated far beyond corporate philosophy. They explained why Carter Dynamics had once been admired not only for innovation, but also for its culture. Somewhere along the way, success had become louder than humility. Richard Holloway finally lifted his eyes. "How long?" he asked carefully. Ethan looked toward him. "How long have you been walking through this building like that?" Richard continued. Ethan offered a faint smile. 3 months. The answer settled over the room like another wave of quiet disbelief. 3 months. 3 months of greeting receptionists, riding service elevators, cleaning hallways, sharing break rooms with custodial teams, and listening to conversations that no executive report would ever capture. "No one knew?" another board member asked. Daniel answered before Ethan could. "Only legal counsel, security leadership, and I were informed. Confidentiality was part of the evaluation." Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. They suddenly realized that every ordinary interaction over the previous 12 weeks might have been witnessed by the man who had founded the company itself. Yet Ethan immediately shook his head. "Please do not misunderstand the purpose," he said gently. "This was never an examination designed to make someone fail. I did not spend my mornings looking for mistakes. I spent them looking for hope." The room grew still again. "And I found it," Ethan continued. His eyes shifted toward the conference room doorway. "Claire Bennett." Claire looked up in surprise as every face in the room turned toward her. She instinctively took one uncertain step forward, still holding the serving tray she had forgotten to set down. "Would you join us for a moment?" Ethan asked. She hesitated before carefully placing the tray on a nearby cabinet and walking into the boardroom. It felt strangely unfamiliar standing inside a room she had entered hundreds of times only to serve coffee. Today, dozens of executives watched her with entirely different expressions. Ethan smiled warmly. "This morning you offered me something no policy required." Claire lowered her eyes slightly. "It was only coffee." Ethan shook his head. "No. The coffee was simply the cup. What you actually offered was dignity." No one spoke. Ethan continued. "You never asked what position I held. You never calculated whether kindness would benefit your career. You simply saw another human being at the beginning of a long day." Claire felt her cheeks warm with quiet embarrassment. "Anyone should have done the same," she answered softly. Ethan's smile widened. "Exactly." He looked around the table once more. "That sentence is the culture we have been trying to build for 20 years. Several board members lowered their eyes. Even Richard could not meet Claire's gaze. Ethan stood from his chair and walked toward the panoramic windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. His reflection appeared beside the city beyond the glass. "This company does not need more impressive resumes," he said without turning around. "It needs more people who understand that respect should never depend on someone's title, salary, office, or uniform." The quiet words lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. No presentation slide could have communicated the lesson more clearly. No financial chart could have measured its value. In that moment, every person present understood that the future of Carter Dynamics would not be decided by quarterly earnings alone. It would be decided every morning in the ordinary moments, when someone chose either to recognize another person's worth, or to walk past without seeing them at all. Claire remained standing near the head of the conference table, still uncertain whether she belonged inside the room, or should quietly return to the executive cafe. She had spent years entering this boardroom carrying trays of coffee, fresh pastries, and glasses of water, always careful to remain unnoticed while important conversations unfolded around her. Today, for the first time, everyone seemed to notice her. The attention felt unfamiliar. Ethan sensed her discomfort immediately. "Please," he said with a reassuring smile, "there is no reason to feel uncomfortable. You are standing here for the same reason everyone else is. Because your choices helped shape this morning." Claire slowly nodded and took a quiet step backward, hoping not to become the center of the meeting. Ethan understood exactly what she was trying to do. Some people chased recognition. Others quietly avoided it. He had always trusted the second kind a little more. He turned his attention back toward the board. "There is one final item before we begin today's agenda," he said. Daniel Mercer immediately closed his notebook. Every executive looked forward again, expecting organizational changes or difficult announcements. Instead, Ethan reached into the leather portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper. 3 months ago, he began, I asked our Human Resources Department to help me conduct an unusual review. It was not based on sales numbers, executive performance, or quarterly earnings. It focused on something much more difficult to measure. Several board members leaned forward. Ethan continued. I asked them to identify employees whose names appeared repeatedly in letters of appreciation from co-workers, visitors, vendors, and clients. Not people receiving awards. Simply people others remembered for making ordinary days a little better. Claire quietly looked toward the floor, paying little attention until Ethan spoke again. One name appeared more often than every other employee combined. He looked toward her with genuine warmth. Claire Bennett. She blinked in surprise. Me? She asked almost in a whisper. Ethan nodded. A delivery driver wrote that you stayed after your shift because his truck broke down during a snowstorm, and you made certain he had a hot meal before waiting for roadside assistance. A receptionist shared that you secretly paid for flowers after learning another employee had lost her grandmother. A visiting client mentioned that you remembered his severe food allergy from a meeting nearly 2 years earlier. Claire felt completely overwhelmed. She barely remembered some of those moments herself. To her they had never seemed extraordinary. Ethan folded the paper carefully before placing it back inside the portfolio. You probably do not remember all of them, because kindness rarely keeps score. The room remained silent. Richard Holloway slowly lowered his head. He realized that during all the years Claire had worked in the executive cafe, he had never bothered to learn her last name. Ethan looked around the table once more. This morning many of you evaluated me based on clothing, assumptions, and status. Claire evaluated me based on nothing except whether another person might appreciate a warm cup of coffee before starting the day. He smiled softly. Those are very different leadership philosophies. Daniel Mercer leaned forward with thoughtful curiosity. What would you like us to do? He asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. Change what we celebrate. Several executives looked puzzled. Ethan continued. Beginning next quarter, every executive performance review will include one additional measurement. Not profit. Not efficiency. Respect. Quiet murmurs spread around the room. Ethan raised one hand gently. If someone cannot consistently treat the receptionist, the cafeteria staff, the custodial team, and the newest employee with genuine dignity, then that person is not demonstrating the leadership this company requires. No one challenged the decision. Deep inside, they understood why it mattered. Ethan turned toward Claire once more. Would you be willing to help us build that culture? Claire looked genuinely confused. I am only a waitress. Ethan smiled with quiet certainty. No, he answered. You are someone who reminds people what leadership looks like before anyone mentions a job title. Claire stood speechless. Around the table, the executives, who had overlooked her countless times, now saw not someone serving coffee, but someone whose everyday choices had quietly taught the lesson they themselves had nearly forgotten. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, and thin rays of sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds, casting gentle reflections across the glass walls of the boardroom as though the building itself had become just a little brighter. The board meeting concluded without applause. No one felt the need for it. Some victories arrived quietly, leaving behind something far more valuable than celebration. As executives gathered their folders and closed their laptops, the atmosphere inside the room had completely changed. Conversations that usually revolved around profit margins and expansion plans now carried a different tone. People greeted assistants by name. Several board members paused to thank the administrative staff waiting outside the conference room. Small gestures began appearing almost naturally, as though everyone had suddenly remembered something they had once known, but gradually forgotten. Claire quietly returned the untouched coffee cups to her serving cart. The boardroom slowly emptied, leaving only Ethan standing beside the wide windows overlooking the city. The rain had stopped completely. Sunlight now reflected from neighboring buildings, filling the room with a warm golden glow that seemed brighter than it had that morning. Claire approached carefully. "Mr. Carter," she began before hesitating. Ethan smiled gently. "Please," he said, "after everything today, Ethan is more than enough." She smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Thank you, Ethan." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the traffic below begin moving through streets still glistening from the rain. Finally, Claire spoke again. "May I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." "Why did you put the uniform back on every morning?" she asked. "You could have walked through these doors as chairman whenever you wanted." Ethan looked toward the skyline before answering. "Because people rarely show you who they truly are when they know your title." He smiled thoughtfully. "A suit opens doors. A uniform opens your eyes." Claire quietly absorbed the words. They sounded simple, yet somehow explained everything she had witnessed during the past 3 months without ever realizing it. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the folded work gloves he had worn earlier that morning. He looked at them for a brief second before placing them neatly on the conference table. "These reminded me of something every day," he said. "No job is beneath anyone. Every honest profession deserves dignity, because every honest person deserves dignity." At that moment Daniel Mercer stepped back into the room carrying a small folder. "I thought you might want this," he said, handing it to Ethan. Inside was a photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier, during the opening of Carter Dynamics headquarters. Dozens of employees stood together outside the newly completed building. Engineers stood beside receptionists. Executives stood beside maintenance workers. Everyone smiled exactly the same. Ethan traced the edge of the photograph with his fingertips. "Back then," Daniel said quietly, "we knew every employee by name." Ethan looked up with a peaceful smile. "Then perhaps it is time we remembered how." Later that afternoon, employees throughout the building noticed something unusual. Richard Holloway stopped outside the custodial supply room and introduced himself properly to every member of the maintenance team. Several executives chose to eat lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of the private dining suite. The receptionist received handwritten thank you notes from departments that had never acknowledged her before. None of these changes were required by policy. They happened because one ordinary morning had quietly changed the way people saw one another. As the workday came to an end, Ethan returned to the executive hallway one last time. The marble floor reflected the evening light, with the same quiet brilliance it had shown before sunrise. Near the entrance, he noticed a single disposable coffee cup resting on a nearby bench. Without hesitation, he picked it up and carried it to the recycling bin himself. Claire watched from across the lobby, smiling softly. Nothing about him had changed after reclaiming the chairman's seat. He still noticed the little things. He still believed no task was beneath him. Before leaving the building, Ethan paused at the revolving doors and looked back one final time. Employees from every department crossed paths beneath the high glass ceiling. Some wore tailored suits. Others wore company uniforms. Yet for the first time all day, it was difficult to tell who held the greater importance. Perhaps that had always been the lesson. Titles may earn attention. Wealth may command influence. Success may fill boardrooms. But respect is the only achievement that follows a person everywhere they go. And sometimes the quietest people inside a building become the ones who teach everyone else how to see.